Hello, everyone, and welcome to our latest campaign for an All-Ireland National Health Service online meeting. My name's Conor Reddy, and I'll be chairing tonight's meeting, where we're going to look at some of the most pressing questions around COVID, the response to the pandemic, and what it all means for healthcare on this island and beyond. So we're almost 1 week into level 5 restrictions here in the south, and other heavy restrictions apply across the north too. So I guess the question on everyone's mind right now is, will this be enough to deliver some light at the end of the tunnel, or will we see, as we did after the summer, another resurgence of the virus down the line? The indication so far from the government and from NPHET in the south is that we're in for a cycle of rolling lockdowns and repeated restrictions. But there are other ways, and tonight we're going to talk a little bit about the option of elimination or a zero COVID strategy. So we're going to address that question, but another important question, I think, is healthcare capacity, and that, of course, is one of the primary motivating factors for the new restrictions. The fact that health services across this island were potentially going to be incapable of bearing the toll of the virus on top of the usual winter crisis. So the big question that arises out of that is, will governments across the island take the time to improve staffing levels, to increase capacity in the health service while the virus is suppressed and restrictions are on? Or will they do as they did in the summer and squander that opportunity? So to discuss these questions and more, I'm joined by three really great speakers who will hopefully cast some light in these very uncertain times. So in the order that they'll speak, they're Professor Anthony Staines, who's a Professor of Health Systems in DCU, and also the founder of the Irish Scientific Advocacy Group, or ISAG, who advocate for an elimination strategy, or zero COVID strategy, it's also known. The second speaker that we'll hear from tonight is Maeve O'Neill. Now, Maeve's a regular on our online meetings at this stage. She's a member of our campaign organising committee and a physiotherapist who works in Altnagelvin Hospital in Derry. And then finally, we'll hear from Julian Marcel. Julian's also a member of the ISAG group, and he's an associate professor in the UCD School of Geography with a special research interest in healthcare and the changing patterns of ownership and control in the Irish health sector. So before I go to our first speaker, I want to ask you all to do us a favour here by sharing the stream so we get this out to as many people as possible. And I'd also like to invite you all to leave your questions and your comments in the comment section. After our three speakers have made their open remarks, we'll take all of your burning questions, so be sure to get them in and get them in early too. So I guess without further ado, we'll hand over to Professor Anthony Staines.
Hiya. So, COVID-19, where are we at? Where are we going? I'm just going to share my screen with you briefly and show you a little bit. Famous last words. Yes. Show you a little bit about what has actually been going on. I think that's the right one. Yeah, it is. Okay, so I'm going to move briskly to this screen here. This is Ireland. We've had 58,000 cases. Most recently, we've had 700 new cases, and we have almost 2,000 deaths, but we're not quite there yet, but we probably will get there. In terms of performance across Europe, for a country of our size, we are mid-table at best. Some European countries have done substantially better. Some have done substantially worse. We tend to flatter ourselves because we look at the UK all the time. And the UK is a COVID basket case, as is the United States. So you should now be able to see a graph showing daily new cases. And this is kind of predictable. This is what tends to happen with these types of infections. So cases started here beginning of March, peaked up very quickly. That very high peak in April is an artifact, but these ones are real. So peaked at 800 cases, 900 cases, 1,000 cases. Very roughly, we think we were missing 2/3 of the cases. So the real case numbers were up here somewhere. There were probably 3,000 cases a day in April. And we brought in a lockdown beginning in March, at the end of March rather, and cases started trickling down fairly steadily. And we got down to extraordinarily low numbers of cases in June. And then what did we do? We opened up again. And in June, my colleagues and I predicted what would happen. We were a bit pessimistic. We thought this peak would happen in September, but it happened in October. We've now gone up to around 1,000 cases a day, 800 cases a day, 900 cases a day. And we are probably finding most of the cases. So these numbers are real. These numbers are seriously shrunk. So the first question about that is, does it matter? There aren't a large number of people dying now. There were a large number of people dying at this point. Again, this extraordinary peak is an artifact. This is not real. This is not actually what happened. But we were getting 50, 70, 60 cases a day. We are now getting single-digit cases a day. I think we had 5 people died today. And 2 things have happened. One is that these cases, many of them arose because we let infection get into nursing homes. And nursing homes are full of frail elderly people who die very quickly from coronavirus. That was a complete disaster. And we have not done that on this go around. The second thing is that the age at infection has fallen. So in this group, there were a very large number of infections in older people, people over the age of 45. In this group, at the moment, most infections are occurring in people under the age of 35, but the number of infections in older people is beginning to rise. And what we've done is we've brought in severe restrictions just about here, and the number of cases is beginning to fall down. And the plan at the moment is that we will let the number of those cases fall down. And by December, beginning of December is about there. By the beginning of December, with a bit of luck, we will have 50 to 100 cases a day. So we'll be back where we were around May. And we will then open up and everyone will go Christmas shopping and everyone will visit for Christmas. And in January, we'll be back here. So the current strategy is what's called living with the virus. I'm going to stop sharing the screen because that tunnel effect is very disorienting. The current strategy of the government is described as living with the virus, and every European country is doing this. And our government hugs themselves and thinks, well, sure, everybody else is doing it. We can't be that far out of line. Actually, everybody else is doing it. That's true. It's a disaster. As I'm speaking to you today in Belgium, they are transferring critically ill patients from Belgian hospitals to hospitals in Germany and Luxembourg for intensive care. I don't know if any of you have ever transferred someone who requires intensive care. I have. It is no fun. It's dangerous. If anything goes wrong, you're basically stuffed. And more to the point, the patient is stuffed. But we're doing it. We are talking in the north right now, also today, because the Northern Ireland is being overwhelmed. We're talking today about transferring patients to the south for intensive care. And that's extraordinary. That's radically new. And it's not good news. So the north is in severe trouble. I'm going to not even talk about England and the United States. They're both basket cases. And you could write a short book entitled How Not to Manage COVID-19. And if you just wrote down what Boris Johnson did and what Donald Trump did, that'd be most of your book written. But the plan in Europe has been driven by what one of my colleagues describes as a sense of European exceptionalism. We have similar numbers of cases to Nigeria. Nigeria has a population, I think, of 140 million. We have a population of 4.5 million. That is not a success by anyone's standards. How have Nigeria done it? Nigeria have done it by boring old public health. And if there is one among you who is not sick being told to wear a mask, wash your hands, sneeze into your elbow or a tissue, avoid social contacts, stay a distance away from people, I will be deeply disappointed. But that is it. That's what you do. That's how you control this. How the health service controls it is not, as some of the narrative would suggest, by building loads of intensive care beds so we can fill them up with sick people with COVID. That's a fool's errand, and it's bad for people, and it's really expensive. The way the health service deals with it is case finding, contact tracing, tracking, testing, and isolation. This is elementary public health, and people have been doing it. Well, the first place I know of that did it at a large scale was a place called Ragusa, which is a town in the Adriatic, which at one time was a rival of Venice. I don't know how they managed outbreaks of disease in classical Rome, but in the 12th century in Ragusa, they had public health people doing pretty much what we do now. Isolation, case identification, separation of cases from the general community, quarantine. And it worked. And we keep doing it, not because public health physicians are hopelessly conservative stick in the muds, but because it works. And but to make it work, it has to be done well. Where European countries have fallen down is haven't done it well, and they haven't enforced isolation. When you come into Dublin Airport, you say where you're going to be for the next 14 days, and you're meant to go there and stay there. And if you're lucky, somebody will ring you from the Department of Transport, or no, Department of Justice, and say, "Hi, are you there?" And you will presumably say yes, whether you are there or not. If you do the same in China, you are taken from your plane to a room in the airport. You are taken from that room in a bus to a hotel room in China, for which you pay, and you stay in that hotel room for 14 days. Now, they look after you. You get fed. If by chance you fall sick, you get looked after, you get tested. But the only way for you to leave that hotel room is if you're going on a flight back to wherever it was you just came from. And that is isolation. That is effective isolation. And many other countries are doing the same thing. New Zealand is doing the same thing. Australia is doing the same thing. You may have heard about the coronavirus outbreak in Melbourne. So Melbourne, which is southern Australia, had more or less brought coronavirus down to zero. And they were quarantining people who traveled into Melbourne from abroad. And essentially, the quarantine broke down due to grotesque negligence, but that's a whole other story. This led to an outbreak of coronavirus, which they were getting 700 or 800 cases a day. Now, Melbourne's a big city. It's bigger than Dublin. And they brought in effectively level 5+ restrictions in Melbourne in August. And they have just released them yesterday morning. To the great joy of everyone in Melbourne, they restricted Victoria, which is the state in which Melbourne is the main population centre. And they released Victoria from its restrictions about 2 weeks ago. And the rest of Australia is essentially back to normal and has been for months. They have a small number of cases in New South Wales, which they're dealing with, but New South Wales is not closing. New Zealand have done something very similar. They had an outbreak in Auckland, and as far as I know, they still don't know where the outbreak came from. They've had one case in the community in last week, which does not seem to have led anywhere. So that person has been tracked, traced, isolated. Their contacts are isolated, tested, and it seems to have stopped. New Zealand's economy is not great, but it's recovering. Australia's economy is largely recovering. China, their economy is actually growing, making them almost the only country in the world whose economy is growing. South Korea, which never brought in lockdowns, but brought in a very aggressive track, trace, and isolate policy, never had to close. They brought in regional lockdowns. At one point, they closed Seoul. At another point, they had closed a city in the southwest, which I will not attempt to pronounce because there's a very large outbreak there. But their economy is stabilizing. It's not shrunk this year. We're actually doing okay. Norway, Denmark, Finland, all of which substantially controlled coronavirus, not by any means completely, their economies have fallen less than other European countries. Countries that have been really badly hurt are Spain, where coronavirus was controlled initially and then reintroduced by tourists from, guess where? Sweden and England, or Britain, has been crippled by coronavirus. Their tourist industry is gone. Their travel industry is gone. A lot of their hospitality sector has closed, and they're in real trouble economically. There is a discussion in the media about ways of managing coronavirus. So you will hear people talking about herd immunity. And I would simply say this, that their proposal for herd immunity that is being talked about, which is essentially to allow everyone to get it, leaving aside the number of people who would die, which isn't the tens of thousands in Ireland, leaving aside that 10% of those infected with this virus will have something like probably 2 to 3 years of significant symptoms afterwards. But as I said, leaving that completely aside, these viruses are familiar to us. You've all had coronavirus infections. They're one of the causes of colds. There are about 80 or 90 causes of colds, which is why you get so many. But the coronavirus is particularly annoying because you can be infected with the same virus on multiple occasions. We do not develop immunity to it. So even on its own terms, the so-called herd immunity argument is nonsense. From a professional point of view, herd immunity is something we achieve with intensive vaccination programs. So as, when, and if we get a vaccine, which hopefully will be this year, or not, well, possibly this year, hopefully early next year, but it isn't guaranteed. But when we do get a vaccine, we will be giving the vaccine to as many people as possible, precisely to lead to herd immunity. However, it is likely we will need to give the vaccine every year. And of the vaccines being tested, the 3 closest to going into production will require 2 doses of vaccine. So unlike your flu shot, where you get 1 shot, and I get a flu shot every year, you will need 2 shots for this. Hi, Julian. You'll need 2 shots for this, which is a logistical challenge that I am quite familiar with, but you may not quite understand the challenge that is. One of the vaccines also has to be kept at -70. And I have no idea how we're going to do that. None. Not the slightest shred. But anyway, we'll worry about that when we get to that point. We'll worry about that. The second choice is what we're doing, which is living with the virus. And the price of living with the virus is extremely simple. It's very easy to show that you cannot keep this virus stably suppressed. There's no stable position with a small number of cases. It's like walking on a wall. You will fall off, and you will only fall off in one direction with a population the size of Ireland. If you've got a population the size of the Faroes, you can actually fall off to zero. But our chance of falling off to zero is non-existent. So the virus will come back, and it will probably come back the way it came back this time. It has been evident to professionals that the virus was coming back since the middle of July. It should have been obvious to NPHET that the virus was coming back, because that's what their model said from the middle of August. But they just ignored it. It was quite extraordinary. I don't know why they ignored it, but they did. The third choice is to try and eliminate the virus. So elimination means doing what they've done in Australia. It means bringing the virus down to zero, so there's no community spread of virus in the country. There is coronavirus, COVID-19 coronavirus, in both Australia and New Zealand, in quarantine, in hotels, in isolation, being tested, being kept away from the general population. But there's no coronavirus in the community. And that's where we go to. Economic analyses from the International Monetary Fund, who are scarcely known for the extraordinary radicalism of their approach to the universe, as well as substantial analyses from the United States, from South Korea, and most recently from the Boston Consulting Group, who are also not known for their radical approach to economics, all say the same thing. They say that you get your economy back by controlling the virus, and that there is no other way to get your economy back. So we have a choice. We have a policy which involves going through again several times what we've gone through over the last month. Or we have the alternative is to continue the current lockdown. And we were arguing this should be done last June in detail. But to continue it, to get the virus down to zero, which will take probably 2 months. So we are talking about after Christmas at this point. We might not, but we probably are. I'm not going to tell you any lies. And get our lives back. My friends in Queensland are going to rugby matches, horse races, parties, pubs, theatres, cinemas, not nightclubs, incidentally. But their lives are returned. Ours can be, but there's only one way to do it, and that's by going through a fairly long period of restriction, aggressive testing and tracing, very aggressive, much better than we're currently doing, and long-term quarantine for air travellers. The end game is they do this all across Europe. We get Europe down to zero COVID, and then we can travel around Europe, as we do for foot and mouth disease, for example. We do this for animals. I think we should try and do it for ourselves. Thank you. That's me.
Thank you for that excellent and really informative intro, Anthony. I think the promise of a zero COVID reality is really, really appealing. I was looking just at the weekend there in Australia, the Australian Football League final was on, and there were over 35,000 people in the stadium, and they were able to watch that safely. So I think if that's one option for people, and the other is a cycle of kind of uncertainty and repeated lockdowns, I know personally what route I'd like to follow and where I'd like to end up. So maybe if people have questions, particularly on the zero COVID strategy and more concrete elements of it, I'm sure Anthony would be able to come back on those towards the end. So next up, we're going to hear from Maeve O'Neill. And as I said before, Maeve is a physiotherapist who works in Altnagelvin Hospital in Derry. So I think what Maeve is going to give us now is a picture of what things are like on the front line, and some of the things that she's been hearing from other healthcare workers like herself, and how we might improve the system for them and for patients. So over to you, Maeve.
Thanks, Connor. Is this echoing a bit?
I think you're okay.
Okay, all right. So thank you for the introduction. As you said, I'm a physiotherapist and I'm working currently in the acute medical wards in the emergency department here in the hospital in Derry. And just to say that this wave is very much different to the first wave, not just because the numbers are so much higher with cases here in our local council area, the worst in the UK. But in the first wave, we had a full proper lockdown, and many of our outpatient services were stood down and resources were poured into the acute services. And for the first time, we felt properly staffed in the hospital. Private hospitals were also utilised to support essential outpatient services, and there seemed to be a good morale from staff and from the public, and that we were all going to tackle this together. And I even look fondly back at the weekly Thursday night clap. And in the first wave, we had rainbows and things on the windows of our houses as signs of support. But now I know it's Halloween in Derry here, which we do love, but the current window dressings of all the things scary is pretty much capturing the current feel of where we're at in this moment of the crisis. The COVID cases who have required hospitalisation are as high as they were at the peak of the first wave, and they're growing. And today I heard in the news there's only 7 ICU beds available in the north today. More beds and ventilators can be made available, but it's the availability of the trained staff to operate those beds safely that's the challenge. We have almost 3,000 healthcare workers in the north off work at the moment through illness or isolation. And that's in a health service that was already chronically understaffed and under-resourced. There's a backlog in care also from the first lockdown. So outpatient services have not been stood down this time, meaning we don't have the option of those staff to come in and support the acute services. I haven't heard anything about the private hospitals either this time around in the north. And worryingly, in terms of the consequences for patients, there's also a 70% drop in cancer presentations, meaning that 7 out of 10 people with a suspicion of cancer aren't coming forward for investigation and then treatment. So to add to this kind of dire picture, it's the time of year that we're in. Every winter in the hospital, we are often at capacity, with people presenting with poor respiratory health, increased infections, and the flu and other conditions. We also have the impacts of a 6-month lockdown on the health of people, and particularly our older population, who have been more isolated and less active, particularly those that, utilise the community health improvement programmes, or even those who just got out and about every day. This has the potential to lead to increased falls, poor cardiac and respiratory health, and poor mental health, all adding more pressure on the hospital. The things that enable people with long-term health conditions to manage them effectively have been stripped away, and this will add the added pressures to the healthcare system this winter. So all the while, staff in the front line are exhausted. Healthcare workers, we can't work from home. We don't get furloughed. We get no extra annual leave to deal with the extreme pressures that we're under. We'll get no bonus at the end of the year. The hospital still operates and still has its challenges, even when COVID isn't swamping us. It doesn't feel like there has been much of a breather between these waves, but yet there's nothing else to do, but you still go to work every day, put your uniform on and care for and support people to get better. The resilience of staff always inspires me, but our resilience in this moment is seriously being put to the test. The stress healthcare workers are working under is phenomenal. It's not just the intensity and the volume of the work, or the fear even of getting COVID, with questions around the effectiveness of the PPE we wear for non-aerosol generating procedures. But healthcare workers have lives outside of work also. We have children who might now be struggling at school because we have had to work during the first wave and fit on their schoolwork after our work or at weekends, which just wasn't enough support. We've strained relationships with partners who had to always kind of step up for childcare, who had to balance their working from home with looking after children, because we, who work in hospitals, have limited flexibility with our jobs. We're also carers, or we have vulnerable people at home and worry that we might be the person who gives them the virus from our work. And we've our own health conditions. There's no getting away from work either, as it's on every news station, every newspaper, and it impacts every part of our lives. And right now, it really is hard to see any end in sight. The government's handling of this crisis has been shambolic. They seem to be grappling in the dark. And this at the moment in the north, they're trying a circuit breaker approach, but it just won't be enough to get the virus under control and eradicate it. And we in health and social care can see the consequences of that every day we go to work. I'm not sure why I expected a competent government response, north or south, when you look at their track record of dealing with health or housing or even environmental issues. It was the people of Ireland and the first wave who made sure we had such low numbers, who made sacrifices so that more people could live. But it feels like people were rushed back to work despite furlough still being in operation in the north till October. Schools went back with little planning and support for teachers and education workers. Workplaces weren't safe, with outbreaks in meat plants and factories, typical of putting profit making being more of a priority than the health and safety of workers. And we were even incentivized to go out in the north to eat out to help out. The World Health Organization from the start has said a lockdown is not enough and that we need to test, track and trace. When we got the numbers under control, these strong public health systems were not strengthened during the summer. How is it that we seem to have no long-term strategy for COVID beyond going on the lockdown, getting the virus under control enough so we can all go out and meet each other for a few weeks until figures go up again and we go back into lockdown again? Why on this island of near 6 million people do we not have an all-Ireland strategy for a virus that does not recognise borders, and a strategy that has successfully been adopted in many other countries towards zero COVID? Just last year, health and social care unions were on industrial action, demanding safe staffing levels and pay parity with NHS colleagues in England and Wales. We had great public support behind this movement. And staffing issues, though, were never properly addressed, and the pay rise really is not enough. Unions are still fighting now for a pay rise to recognise the essential work and sacrifices of frontline health and social care workers. We need fighting unions to continue to protect workers' rights during this pandemic, but also to lead the call for the type of recovery needed. We can't continue to work in an underfunded health and social care system. We can't keep giving big payouts to private hospitals and private care providers so that they can make a profit from our public money. We can't have unequal access to health and social care so that the poorest suffer in terms of access, but also in the greater health inequalities that poor and marginalised people face. Going forth from this crisis, we need to call for a fully funded all-Ireland national health and social care service, but we can't wait for those in power to come to this realisation, for it'll never happen. We need to build this movement from the ground up and demand this change on an all-Ireland basis. Thank you.
Thank you, Maeve, for that really, really insightful contribution. I think it's really worth getting a sense of things from the front lines. And I mean, the issue you raised there, probably come back to it in the questions about the absence of a kind of worked out all Ireland strategy is particularly striking. I'm sure where you are in Derry, it's fairly evident the fact that Donegal's been a hotspot in the 26 counties for quite a long time, and you see the consequences of that absence of a joined up cross-border approach. So I think we maybe come back to that one in a little while. Okay, so our final speaker for this part of the meeting will be Julian Marseille. As I said earlier on, Julian is an associate professor in DCU. He works in the School of Geography. But Julian's special expertise here tonight will be on healthcare systems across Ireland and the changing patterns of ownership. And I think Maeve touched on some of the issues around staffing and capacity. And I think Julian might talk about that a little bit more, and about how kind of neglect and structure of our health services across the island have affected our ability to actually deal with this pandemic. So over to you there, Julian.
Okay, hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Can you see me? I've been struggling for the last 35 minutes with technological problems, so just shout if you can't see. I'm at UCD, Connor, not DCU, but it doesn't matter. They're both good institutions, as long as you don't say Trinity. No, I'll actually. Okay, I'm in the middle of funding applications, so I jumped into this a bit late. But what you said, Connor, is exactly what I had prepared. So I'm glad that we're on the same page. So I'll share my screen, I hope. Can you see this?
Is that the one you're looking for, Julian?
Yeah, the Mersil 2018. Yeah?
No, it's your browser that's up at the minute.
Really? Okay. It's the PowerPoint one.
Okay.
If it doesn't work, I can just go without it. Let's not waste so much time. But I'm trying to share my PowerPoint.
I'll try it once more. If you click the share screen button once more there, Julian, and try hold screen or try application or hold screen and click it there.
Okay, I have stop screen. That's what I have. Should I stop screen and share again?
Yeah, if you could.
Okay. Now share screen. Share screen.
Fingers crossed this time. Something going up there at all.
Entire screen. Allow.
Okay. That's
so now I'll go to my PowerPoint. Can you see PowerPoint now?
No, you're still on the this window, actually, the studio window.
Okay. Should I do it without then? It's not, I have really nice slides from my papers, but it doesn't, I'll try to describe them, okay? So, this is my second laptop, doesn't work. Anyway, so like Connor said, I work on privatization of healthcare in Ireland. So what I've done is to look at how it's been, the private sector has been encroaching on the public sector over the last 20, 30 years or whatever, depending on the actual components of the system we look at. So the slide I wanted to show you was about nursing homes, because of course they've become all over the news. I mean, believe it or not, I would never have bet that nursing homes would be all over the news a year ago, but because a lot of the deaths associated with COVID are in nursing homes, we talk about that a lot. And in Ireland, it's very interesting that today it's about 80% of the nursing homes. We have about 600 that are private, for profit, and 20% that are public. And if you go back 30, 40 years ago, it was the exact mirror image. It was mostly a public system with a minority of private owners, private homes. So on my graph, you have two lines like this that go up and down, that cross. It's a mirror image, right? So you have an inversion, in other words, since 1980, and it's just very striking. You couldn't have a bigger transformation under the system. Ireland is not an exception here. Other countries have had the same. So the question here is, what does that imply for our ability to react to COVID, to respond to the pandemic, and also in general, for care? Now, in Ireland, there's not been any study, as far as I know, about care quality and private versus public, because as often it's a small island, so there's not too many people working on that. But international evidence tells us that when there's profits involved, the quality can be a bit more deficient, but it will remain to be investigated. Now, if you read the reports that came out about COVID and nursing homes, there's been quite a few from the Parliament and other bodies. They all say the same thing, is that the problem is a lack of coordination or supervision. When you have a sector that's split into, a large part of it is on the private side, then you don't have as much coordination with the public side. So when you have a big pandemic like this, it's kind of difficult. So that's one issue. Lack of clinical oversight is another one that's related. They're regulated, the nursing homes, but again, there's varying standards, right? And that goes for the private side, but also the public side. You could have like a poorly funded system, for example. So that's for the nursing homes.
Another slide I wanted to show you, a very nice slide. It took me a long time to get put together because I had to call every hospital in the country, every private hospital. It's something similar, but for the acute hospital system. So I looked at the number of beds, and what you see since 1980 again is that on the public hospital side, number of beds has decreased significantly due to cuts in beds in the 80s, for example. And then the second big cut years are the last 10 years during austerity. And so that you have that curve going down on my slide. And then you have another curve, if you look at the private hospitals, number of beds is going up. So it's really, again, a mirror image. So not only have they not reduced the number of beds in total in the system on the private side, but they've increased them. Again, you have a privatization of the hospital system. And what does that imply for the COVID response? Well, again, it's a bit the same thing as with nursing homes. So you have a system that's not fully coordinated. And I'll always remember there's someone in the CSO who knew their stuff, and they told me, look, you and me could open a private hospital tomorrow morning. It's not really tightly coordinated, right? It's a bit like, well, it's a business, that's what it is. So we've seen what the government had to resort to a few months ago was to strike a deal with the private hospitals. And then, of course, if you're there begging for their help in time of crisis, you don't exactly have the strong negotiating side, right? I mean, you have some power, but it's not the same as if you had the system under public control. And so we saw all the kind of little problems that this gave rise to. First of all, the price tag was criticized by both people on the left and on the right as being really high. And then half the consultants refused to go along with the contracts, so it's all those kind of bugs that you encounter, of course, if you don't have somewhat of a more unified system. Just looking at my notes if I have something else. That's pretty much it for the hospitals. Another sector that I've looked at is home care. That's the thing I'm doing right now. And again, it's really the same thing. If you look at especially the last 10, 15 years, the system has really put more emphasis on private providers of home care, whereas before they were much smaller. They were actually almost non-existent, really, the private for-profit ones. Now, what does that imply? Well, again, there's no study of quality as far as I can tell in Ireland or in many other countries, but it's a bit of a lack of coordination. When the COVID crisis happened, the government had to support the private sector home care providers, and then you have this negotiation. How much should we give them? If you want to redeploy staff to nursing homes, for example, well, if they were all within the public sector, it'd be easier. Now you have a bit of gaps in the oversight or in the strategy that you adopt, because you have this independent sector, which may or may not do a good job. But the point is that it's a different animal that you're trying to line up with your national priorities. And okay, I have a fourth. I have to go through all of the research I've done right over the last few years. Primary care centers. Those were and still are, well, as it says, a place where you have a GP and a physiotherapist, other specialists. And again, the original plan 20 years ago was to have that, whatever the plan was, a bit of a mix in public and private. But over time, it really went the private on the private path much more than the public one. So recently, like 2 years ago or so, we've had a few of those primary care centers develop through public-private partnerships, for example. So that's important because it's demonstrated pretty well that those types of arrangements, they cost more money than a public type of arrangement where the state would just, contract for, procure for the building of those centers. So you have the private sector that's owning a lot of buildings, the primary care centers themselves. Now those centers have been used and could be used even more as testing hubs for COVID, for example. I don't know what impact the private or public had on this, if any, but you could imagine another situation where the private sector has encroached a bit more on the public sector, and when comes the time to react to an emergency or just for regular care and health service, you wouldn't have the same type of control over the system, and you have to negotiate constantly with another entirely different sector, separate, that has other interests. There's a health aspect, but there's also, of course, a profit aspect. So you're constantly in some kind of negotiation to reach goals that should be more streamlined. That's pretty much what my 4 slides had to show you. And the pattern is very striking across most of the sectors. It's always going more towards private. And the way to fix that, maybe we can leave that for the Q&A, but there's a range of options, ones that are specific to the healthcare system. Where do we put the money that we have? And there's broader issues as well on just redistribution of income in society. If you want to have more money for healthcare in the first place, then maybe you need to play with taxation regimes or whatever. And that, I think, is the way to kind of transform it to make it a bit better. That's it.
Thanks for that, Julian. That was, again, really insightful. I think the work that you're doing there, and it shows the work that you're doing shows how the private sector affects our response and the efficiency of our response to the pandemic is really, really important. But I think on a grander level, it's important too, because for years we've had a private sector that's been propped up and I guess facilitated by the state, and I think none of the mainstream parties at the minute are prepared to take on those interests. So that was a comment there from Marnie, who says hi, by the way, Julian. So thanks for that. And I think because the breadth of your work, we might actually, if you were up for it, get you back on to discuss the broader trends in privatisation of healthcare. Something our campaign, I think, are very interested in. So I might go now to some questions and comments from our audience. And I know you have to go quite soon, Anthony. So I'll maybe put the first question to you. Okay. So this one is from Alva Smith. And Alva asks, does Professor Steyn think that we can implement a zero COVID strategy here without jeopardizing crucial civil liberties? I'm asking this because there's a considerable number of people who are still not observing the restrictions. I'm nervous about the growing tendency for government to think in terms of criminal offences, fines, etc.
It depends what you define as crucial civil liberties. If you're civil, there's a famous comment about freedom of movement, which is your freedom to move your hands around stops about 2 centimeters in front of my nose. In the same way, I think your freedom of association stops when you're placing other people at severe risk of infection. So part of the price for living in a complex, structured, high-density society like ours is that at times there will be restrictions in your movement. You can only travel on one side of the street. If you try and drive your car the wrong way up the road, you will at the very least be upbraided by those about you. It is possible for democratic, open societies to introduce the kind of restrictions here that are required. And one of the nice things about public health is you don't require perfection, because you're not relying on single things to work. You're relying on defense and depth to work. So you probably end up where they've gone to in Australia, which is that, as the guards say, by and large, they do not arrest people for breaching the quarantine regulations. They appraise them of the regulations and encourage them to go back to wherever they were coming from. And if they won't, if they keep going, they will arrest them. In Australia, they're actually harder than that. If you breach the regulations, particularly flagrantly, they will fine you. So the fine for driving your car from Melbourne to the exclusion zone around the Victoria border is 6,000 Australian dollars per person. and it's payable on the spot. And that 6,000 Australian, that's about, if you've got two people in your car, that's about 6,000 euros. So can we do that? I don't know. Every culture is different, and every culture has to come up with their own solutions. But for example, many of the cases in Cavan have arisen from two situations. One is from a group of lunatics who went to a wedding in Fermanagh, where there were, at the time, there were no restrictions in Fermanagh, and then came back to Cavan and proceeded to infect all about them. And the other is from two large parties held by a winning team and a losing team in two different GAA matches. And these weren't held by the GAA, by the way. They were held by people who were of an age, and they weren't held by mad teenagers either. They were held by people who were of an age to know better. But if you want to know why has Cavan got so many cases, that's why. So are we justified in penalising people who engage in that type of behaviour? As is proposed, if you organise a major party in your house, you'll be fined. If you're at a party and you refuse to leave, you can be fined. Are we justified in doing that? I don't know. I think we probably are. But there's room for reasonable discussion about it. And I do think the Guards' approach is generally reasonable. And I accept that the way the Guards deal with different communities in Ireland is not the same. And that's a whole other problem, which predates COVID-19. But it is nonetheless, most of the Guards behave reasonably sensibly. If you want to see how stupid police can be, the Welsh police put a barrier across the centre of an open-air cinema site in Wales, which was on the English-Welsh border. The toilets were on the Welsh side. They sent police officers. This is God's own truth. They sent police officers to sit on the border and arrest people who wanted to use the toilets in Wales. Now, so that's insane. That's really bad policing. And I think, to be fair to the Guards, they don't usually do that. Okay. I saw the mess after the party in the Oliver Bond. I don't know if you remember that, but there was a major party by people from outside the Oliver Bond in an open area in the Oliver Bond Flats complex. And they left it looking like a bomb site afterwards. And the people who ran that party were members of the settled community from outside the Oliver Bond who just found an empty space of land and made life miserable for everybody else. Should the Guards have been able to penalise them? Yeah, probably. You know, if I hold a party for 500 people outside your front door, I think you might be unhappy about it. So that's my thoughts on it.
Okay, so I'll maybe come back on that one just as a follow-up, because we've heard from groups like the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, and also I believe a group of researchers in NUI Galway who've looked at the efficacy of approaches that are based on fines and penalties and policing. And I think their findings really suggested that they weren't necessarily the most effective measure. I wonder how would you respond to that? And I guess what would you make of other approaches that centre more on education and empowerment of people to know better? I guess there always will be the minority of people who do stupid and unreasonable things, but what would you make in the grander scale? What is the best strategy here?
I think communication is the heart of this, and one of the reasons that there's been so much anger about the second lockdown, although there's widespread public support for it, but it's because people cannot see an outcome. They cannot see where all this is going. And when the government has finally been driven to describing their vision for the future, which is a series of lockdowns until such time as we have an effective vaccine. Now that by the grace of God, that will be next autumn, but it might not be. It might take several years to produce an effective vaccine. So we could be doing this till 2024. I rather hope not, but we could. So giving people a clear destination as to where they want to go is really important. One of the biggest failings of the English government has been the complete failure to indicate what they wanted to achieve. Blethering on about world-beating testing systems is not really a goal in most people's lives. They want to get their lives back. They want to get their jobs back, which is a very reasonable request. And I think one of the earlier questions has pointed out that there's a huge social gradient in this disease.
Yeah.
This is a disease that picks out the weak spots in every society. And we're not unique in that. But it is very much up to it's very much up to the government to use that information and to say, what are we going to do to make it better? What are we going to do to improve the quality of care in nursing homes and safety in nursing homes? What are we going to do to get rid of direct provision centres? What are we going to do about overcrowded, poor housing? We talk, for example, about the outbreaks in the meat factories. It would have been more accurate to say there were outbreaks in the housing for the workers in the meat factories, because that's where a lot of the infection seems to have happened. So we really have to look out very widely at this. This is not just an infectious disease. This is the way a society has responded to an infectious disease. And it hasn't been very positive. And as I said, we've done much better than some other European countries, but we've done much worse than some others. So we really have to learn, and learn quickly. I mean, learn in the next week or two from what's worked elsewhere and do something about it now. But there's also the longer term issues. It has brutally exposed the inability of HSE to execute. I mean, they're hiring, I think, 800 more contact tracers who will be in place in 8 weeks' time. That is absolutely no use to God or man. They're in the wrong place. They're not trained to do the job that needs to be done. The call centre is important, but it's not where the hole is. The hole is in regional public health.
Yeah.
And we can train people to work in regional public health at the standard required, but it takes about a week to train them. But I've done it. I mean, I could do it. A dozen of my colleagues could do it with their eyes shut. They could train that group of people. But we'd have to decide we're going to do it. We'd have to hire them. We'd have to actually make decisions. And we're paying for the fact that HSE is often incapable of execution. On the other hand, the digital stuff in HSE was presented at lunchtime today at a completely different meeting. And there's been some extraordinary innovation brought in at high speed. They brought in an app to monitor oxygen levels in people at home, which they reckon saved about 20,000 bed nights in March and April. I mean, that is huge. They brought it in a week and a half. They built the system for contact tracing, which is flaky and doesn't integrate very well with anything else. But they did build it in 10 days. So we can do stuff, but often we don't. And we pay the price for that. So, sorry, I'm rabbiting on.
Okay, thanks very much for participating, Anthony, and thanks for offering your expertise.
Thank you for asking me.
And yeah, I'm sure we'll have you back again at some other meeting in the not too distant future, hopefully. Thank you.
Okay, this is Connor. Thanks a million. God bless. Bye-bye.
Okay, so Anthony had to leave there. I'm going to put the question that I think Anthony touched on there a second ago to both of you. And it's a question, I think, of the social gradient that COVID follows. And I'm sure you've both seen it, and I'm sure we've all seen those maps of the different local electoral areas around the country, and how the least well-off areas tend to do the worst in terms of infection and also outcomes. So this comes from Avril, and she asks, trends across LEAs in Ireland mirror global trends, which show that COVID-19 follows a definite social gradient. People who are poor or marginalised are at greater risk of infection and typically have poor outcomes. Could the panel comment on this trend and the importance of addressing it? So Anthony got some of that already, but maybe we'll go to you, Maeve, first on that, maybe. how do you think we could address it?
I suppose it's important to understand the body's stress system and why this might be the case for people, you know, because we've seen with BME communities and also poorer people have been disproportionately impacted by the virus. So I suppose there's two determinants on our body's stress system, and that's physiological stress, so like air, noise, and light pollution, and physical discomfort, and psychosocial stress like poverty, job insecurity, the experience of discrimination, and say a global pandemic. So if our body stress system is overloaded, then we experience wear and tear of our body's immune, endocrine, and metabolic systems. So that's our ability to fight illness, and we also become more susceptible to illness. So in terms of how we address it, I know like in working in healthcare, there's so many times where in order for us to actually help the person that we're working with, we need to change the world around them. And this is where, as activists and as healthcare workers, we need to make our voices heard and not just in how the health service is run, but how our communities are built and how our public health systems are operated, and even things around air quality, about green space, healthy food, and really tackling income inequality, because over the last few years, inequality has become greater, and I know that like everyone's mad keen to get back to normal, but the way that we were living was not normal with the inequalities that we were living in. So we need to organise, because I know that the people who are making all the money are well organised, and we need to organise to make sure that you know, inequality is reduced in our communities, and yeah, it'll only come from movements on the ground.
I might phrase it a bit differently for you, Julian, because I think another part of this is access to health services. And I guess people in more marginalised groups have shown kind of repeatedly to have poorer access. So how do you think kind of the structure of health services and access, I know there's outbreaks at the minute happening in halting sites across the country, and obviously people in the travelling community have poorer access, but how do you think the system is configured and maybe locks in some of those health inequalities?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't know much of the details, to be honest, on that, but it's there's a very well-known law that there's fewer health services in poor communities, right? So it just goes with everything else. So that's definitely part of it. And also, I think the types of jobs, there's a lot of lowly paid service jobs, right, that don't help compared to, you know, more privileged neighborhoods where everybody's online and nobody really is affected that much. In Ireland, there's been a very good report, if people want to read on that, by Task, an NGO, about social determinants of health 2 years ago or so, about exactly what you said, Connor. So really looking at, you know, life expectancy by gender and by geographical location, and it matches exactly the local electoral data we've seen. But yeah, beyond that, I mean, I don't really know like the actual access to healthcare and details for those places, but I think that it's really more about the type of employment and the way I understand it, why we see those differences. And it's actually a bit sad that the data, for me, that's some of the most important data we've had about the local area. It took like, 6 months to get that, and they can't update them. They're always 3 weeks late or something like that. So it really, and for me, it really shows the importance of a community approach to monitor those things. Some of the countries that have been very successful, like Thailand, to deal with the COVID pandemic, they sent, what they call them, village health people or something, a bit like Anthony was saying, thousands of them everywhere and checking on people's doors if things were going okay, because they know the communities, they know the needs and the resources. But I feel in Ireland, like in many other countries, you know, if you ask me in my community who are the GPs, okay, I know the one on the street, but I don't know the others. It wouldn't be that hard to get a few GPs, a few schools, to have a good network of information. It's hard to make good decisions without information. Anyway, I'm digressing a little bit, but
Thanks for that, Julian. And yeah, just some of that information that you mentioned from the task study is kind of mirrored and got at in actually our last online public meeting for those who are watching and interested, as an meeting on health inequalities. We had speakers in Social Justice Ireland and some other places too that went through all of those trends and where they come from. So people are interested in that. I'd encourage you to work or to look back. We're going to maybe change course a little bit here. We have an interesting contribution from Joe Tully. So Joe has this over 2 comments, so I'll just read them out. First is, I'm a frontline healthcare worker. I work as a theatre nurse in one of the largest hospitals in the country. Neither I nor any of my healthcare colleagues have been either screened or tested in the last 6 months prophylactically, despite the INMO demanding that we're tested on a weekly basis. The irony of this is that all of our elected patients are tested prior to admission, but the staff are not. What a ridiculous and dangerous position. I'd appreciate comment on this situation. And I'll just follow up. She's left one more comment here that I think is worth reading out. And it's that student nurses in Sligo just last week who are ready to go to care for elderly people were denied tests for COVID despite being in contact with a person who was positive. One of the nurses who feared that she might bring the virus into the elderly care facility with fatal results was so worried that she exaggerated her symptoms to get a test, having been denied one. She and her colleagues were to start in the elder care facility on Monday. Her test is reported positive. So we have there quite a shocking story, really, to be honest, of how there hasn't been proper screening, prophylactic screening of healthcare workers. So, since you are a healthcare worker, Maeve, put that to you. What's been your experience with testing on the ground? Have you had access to tests without symptoms? And what other stories have you heard?
I suppose in our trust, our cancer services, there's weekly testing for staff who are working on the cancer services, and I'd say that was fought for by the consultants there, because there was an outbreak in one of the other hospitals in one of the cancer units, and it was devastating, with losses of life. And the other positive thing that happened in terms of testing, just coming out of the first wave, was all care homes, and so residents and staff in care homes are having routine testing. I think it might be fortnightly rather than weekly. So again, it's positive that the most vulnerable people, that they're starting with routine testing for those groups. I know that there are hopes to expand that out. I think, as Joe had said, with staff who are working in surgical areas, but it hasn't yet been expanded, and I think it is a capacity issue at the moment, because I suppose just our council area is just totally swamped with testing, and I know that the testing within the community is much quicker in terms of the results than the testing in the hospital. And often our lab results are having to go to Belfast, so they haven't increased the capacity of labs at all within the hospital. And that's where the consequence is. So that I'm sure they'd love to test all the staff, but the capacity isn't there at all. So they've had to prioritise. And I'm glad for cancer services and for the residential and care homes.
Thanks for that, Maeve. So again, I might put it a bit differently to you, Julian. Just in a general sense, we've seen, again, I think that the consequences of kind of doing COVID on the cheap and of outsourcing. We heard in the Dáil last week stories of how tracing was outsourced to CPL, a private health contractor, who actually were part of the Call for Ireland, which recruited nurses and other healthcare workers in the first wave. We heard how CPL weren't offering them they were offering 0-hour contracts and also poor pay and no entitlement to sick leave. So I guess, could you maybe comment generally on the deficiencies in testing and tracing, and what needs to happen, how we should improve testing and tracing if we're going to get a handle on the virus?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, again, I'm not a specialist on that. Anthony would be better placed than me, but I mean, we've seen in the UK the outsourcing to private companies is really a disaster for all of that. On the other hand, in ISAG, some people argue that we should have gone more with the private sector, not because of the principle necessarily, but when you have nothing else, you might as well have that than nothing, and have a very, a thin contact tracing system. So I think it's a bit of kind of paying for the lack of investment in the past in that respect, right? I mean, sometimes it's a bit what privatization is, that you don't invest in the public sector, and then the only option you have is the private sector. So I think it's more of a longer term issue, to be honest. Like right now, you need to do with what you have or what you don't have, and then if we want to build the infrastructure, scientific or testing or whatever, that's another thing that is a bit more of a long term plan.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we see at the minute the clinical laboratory scientists are in a dispute with the HSE because of a long-standing issue they've had with the lack of career structures, defined career structures, and decent pay. So you've heard anecdotally stories of people from the public system, public hospital labs, and places like the National Virus Reference Lab leaving to go to work in the private sector because there are better terms and conditions there. So I think until that long-term issue of from decent terms of employment and also properly resourced services, until that's dealt with, I think we're probably leaving ourselves weak to deal with this pandemic. So I'll go to another kind of more tangential question here, but a very important one all the same, and that's just from Christopher Carroll. So this is what is the role of unions in protecting workers' health during COVID, or whose job is it to protect the health of health workers? I actually have a similar one here from Marnie that I'll read out very quickly. No, I don't. So I guess this one is getting at something quite deep. I think in the first wave of the pandemic, we had one of the highest rates of healthcare worker infection. So I might go to you on that one, or to you, Maeve, on that one. Comment just generally on the importance of unions in protecting workers' health.
Yeah, I suppose the union is a body which represents workers and workers' needs, and with together we're a lot stronger when we're brought together within that body, and also with unions working together we're even stronger still in terms of our voice, and it's an avenue for our concerns to be raised. And I think unions have their strength has been diluted, I think, since the Maggie Thatcher era and the anti-trade union laws. But I think particularly with the strike last year, we began to feel our strength again, and with the victory of the pay rise, we're starting to find our feet and feel our strength. And I think it's difficult right now, particularly for healthcare workers, because we are so tired, and it's hard to fight the battle that you need to fight for your own rights when you're fighting so hard to get through your day of work to support people. And that's where unions play that role to support workers when they have no energy to fight, because we should be so angry right now, we should be up in arms and things, but again, I don't think we have the energy to be angry. We're just getting through each day in the best way that we can. And that's where having people who are full-time working for the union and organising and bringing issues to the fore that are important for workers is really, really key. But we still need more active unions. We need fighting unions. We need unions that aren't afraid to criticise management and to threaten strike action. Because there's so many issues at the moment. I know I'm a union rep for my physio union, and there's just issue after issue, and it's so hard to keep on top of it because the stress among staff is unreal. So So unions have such a role in making the positive change for workers' rights, to protect workers' rights, but also in creating the type of healthcare system that we need coming out of this. It's not good enough to fight fires or to try and fix this gaping wound in our healthcare service with a sticky plaster. We really need a transformed health service. We can't keep going on like this. Staff are already burned out even before COVID, hit us. We were already losing staff because of that as well. So, unions need to play a leading role in transforming the healthcare service, but also transforming the society in which we live, so that we have healthier communities, because our healthcare is a civil right and it needs to be part of a civil rights movement.
Thanks for that, Maeve. Do you want to come in on that one too, Julian? Or
well, yeah, I think a lot of that stuff is not like there's no magic recipe or solution. The unions are very important as the organizations that can represent. It's kind of a form of economic democracy in the workplace, to have a say in how your workplace is organized and all that. So they're very important. In Ireland, they're very weak in my experience, and they're very often not responsive to what their members are saying. So people get demoralized, and then it's kind of a vicious cycle. I think the important thing in general is it's what I find often is that people go to meetings or to actions, and everybody agrees on what's wrong with the system. That's not very hard to identify. Everybody agrees on what it should be. That's very easy as well. But nobody talks about how to get there with concrete actions. Do you have a community campaign in front of a hospital, or do you have a petition? Do you have a humoristic campaign, or whatever you're doing? That's what needs to be emphasized, because everybody knows that the waiting lines are crazy in Ireland. Everybody knows it should be reduced, and we don't need to talk about that too much. But how do you get there? Do you have a media campaign? Do you start an alternative media campaign? Do you target young people or whatever? And I think unions should really put a lot of emphasis on that, and community groups in general. And if there's one issue that people will come out, whether they're crazy conservatives or crazy on the left, or in between, is to save the healthcare system. It's cross-class, You'll have like rednecks next to Marxists fighting for their local hospitals, right? It's very unique, because not every issue is like that. Every day, every time we have a poll in Ireland, what's your most important issue for this election? It's always healthcare or housing, healthcare. So the popular wishes there is just to tap it and organize it, and it's very difficult to do, but that's kind of, like I said, there's no magic recipe for that. I think it's just constant work.
It's even more difficult in the middle of a pandemic. I mean,
exactly.
What to do with the campaign here?
We need to get zero COVID first.
Zero COVID, and then we'll have a campaign for an all-Ireland NHS. I guess it seems we're talking about alternatives here, and you got it a bit in your intro, Julian. What do you think the alternatives are? You mentioned possibility of a greater kind of public service, but what do you think the most pressing things that need to be changed in the health service structurally?
I think in the health service proper, there's issues of privatization. That's what I work on, right? You don't want to have the profit motive too involved in healthcare, because then decisions start to be made for market and price reasons as opposed to health. All the private health insurance, I think, for me is a good target, because it doesn't add anything. They're just middlemen. Like you could say a private hospital, you could say I don't agree with it, but at least they're providing a service, whether it's good or not good, or it's something. The private insurance, I just don't get it. It should really be an easy target, I think. There's a lot of bureaucracy in the public sector. Is always the same thing. You have a very top-down structure. So during the austerity years, the HSE was not exactly like hiring more nurses and doctors and all that, but they were hiring more senior managers. I mean, or value consultants, or to change the cultural values of the HSE. This is not easy to identify as a source of waste. I mean, it's just, and it's the same thing in universities or other areas of the public sector. So I think in activism you need to pick battles you will win. If you pick battles you will lose, there's no point fighting them, right? It's just like to make people feel good or something. You need to pick winning battles, and that's one thing. Everything to do with religion as well. Religious orders involvement in the healthcare system today in 2020. Everybody gets that this is not exactly the perfect way to go. So they're kind of easy battles, I think, compared to other aspects that, you could always say, let's transform the whole thing or whatever, but I would focus on that. That's what I would do if I could.
Yeah, the insurance industry doesn't strike me as an easy battle, given the grip that it has on the sector. But I mean, we agree, and I guess as a campaign, we obviously our grand goal here is the establishment of an All-Ireland NHS. But I guess we do want to mobilise people locally too. We want to mobilise people on the things that we actually can win on. So that's why I think the minute in Derry, where Maeve is, we're working with the healthcare worker unions to win them a pay rise in the middle of a pandemic, when I think that the weight of public opinion is well behind the healthcare workers on that one. And I think there's other examples of that. Just to go back now to, I guess, the big issue, private, public. There's a question here from Willie Cummins. Does a private sector in health depend on the public sector? And I guess we've all heard about the kind of subsidies that are there for people that want to build private hospitals. We know about the tax reliefs for people to take out private health insurance. But would the private sector be viable if it weren't for the public purse and public supports? What do you think, Judy?
Well, in many ways, in many respects, let's say in home care or nursing homes, the revenue they have is public money, right? So they're businesses, but they're not really operating in a market, right? It's if there's no government paying for their services, they all go bankrupt, right? So that's a massive dependence. That's why there is a lot of leverage in the public sector to shape things, So I think that's the biggest one, probably. Actually, the private sector, as we know, they pick the procedures that are easy and quick, like knee surgery or whatever, because they don't take the A&E, right? Because there's no money to be made there. So in the way they depend on the public sector to have those nice procedures to be done. But yeah, I think it's a lack of investment in the public sector that really goes. Jimmy Sheehan, who founded BlackRock Clinic, which is the biggest, most famous one in Ireland, he said it himself in the 80s. He was asked how did this arise? He said, well, I just noticed that the public sector couldn't meet the demand, so that's it. I just opened it. So that's one way, very indirect. It's not direct support, but it's really the result of that. So I think the money has to be shifted to public sector, and people have to understand as well. I think that is it's kind of special with healthcare is that public healthcare is both cheaper overall and better quality. And so that's a win-win. In some situations, you could say it's more expensive, but the quality is better, right? Or we save money, the quality is less. It's a win-win across the board. So it's really hard to argue in favor of a private system. And it's very easy to argue against it as an activist or a union, because the only argument is really there's not enough capacity and some people want to go first or something like that, right? Which is not exactly a very powerful argument. You don't have that in every social issue. But in this case, it's a winner. So I think to put that in the public mind, because I don't think often people see it as private sector is more efficient, but it's just not fair or something like that, which is a weaker form of argument that, no, it's not fair and it's not as good. So I would try to have this kind of ideological campaign, if you can call it like that.
Great. Thanks for that, Julian. I think we've kind of digressed from the topic of the meeting here, so I'm actually going to pull it back now to a question about COVID and COVID strategies again. I will put this one to you first, Maeve. So this one's from Alexandra, and she says that it seems like Micheál Martin went out of his way to misrepresent zero COVID strategies in his address. So this is his address last week. How do you think we can popularise this message and fight off misinformation? So how do you think we win people to a different kind of COVID strategy?
I think it would be interesting to hear from healthcare workers in the countries where zero COVID strategy is working. You know, I think to keep going into lockdown and having a bit of freedom and then back into lockdown again, it's too hard to not see a light at the end of the tunnel, particularly for healthcare workers where, you know, there isn't ever a let up in work. And so I think it would be, yeah, I think we need a better strategy. From what I'm hearing on the news, like I think the journalists are challenging our politicians that, you know, is there, like, what is the strategy? Is it only this to keep going into lockdown? So, you know, I think we need to educate ourselves on exactly what zero COVID means. Learn from the countries that are doing it well. Learn from those healthcare workers and from those public health workers in those countries. And we, you know, we need to, you know, challenge our elected representatives, whether that's through writing letters, petitions, having conversations about it within our workplaces, within our families, within our Zoom chats or WhatsApp groups, however way we keep in touch with people. And, you know, if we're educated, then we can organise better to you know, demand that this strategy happens, because we definitely need it. And you know, why not Ireland lead on the strategy? But the challenge and the zero COVID strategy is the border, and that's where this All Ireland kind of health service dimension comes in, because we have the complications of England, Scotland, and Wales following a lot of what they do, whilst living on a border with another divergent health strategy. So we really need to kind of work on that border question when it comes to health strategy and health policy. So it needs to be cross-border, because there's too many people who live and work on either side of the border, and it really, really does need to be cross-border. So again, we need to pile the pressure on the politicians to actually work together in a meaningful way.
Thanks, Maeve. I guess I'll put the same question to you, Julian. Like, the start of it, if you didn't catch it, was just Micheál Martin in a speech last week went kind of out of his way to rubbish or to brush off the possibility of an elimination strategy on the island. And he obviously touched on the border as kind of the key thing holding us back. But how do you think, you're part of that Irish scientific advocacy group, we can popularise an elimination strategy and kind of build an understanding? What do you think are the most important tasks there?
Well, this is a good question. I'd say the first thing is to look at just the basic facts. The Wall Street Journal last week had an article saying, to solve COVID, look east, look to Asia. Asian countries have dealt with it very, very well. I mean, zero COVID is not like an idealistic kind of situation. It's real. Australia is nearly there. New Zealand, of course, Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, China, Japan is pretty low as well. Korea, Taiwan. I mean, there's a lot of countries there. It's not just like one random island here and there. The failure is Europe and the West. It's just really maybe what people don't want to hear. So every country that has eliminated COVID has pursued an elimination strategy. By definition, you can't get there if you don't pursue that. So that's one thing. And the challenge is really to find inspiration from those successful countries. And again, there's more than one or two. And to apply that to Ireland. Ireland is lucky in that it's an island. Okay, there's Northern Ireland, but it's not like if we have 6 countries around us. And to go on from there, I like the strategy of county by county or region by region. In Australia, which is a good model for Ireland, according to myself and ISAG, the state of Victoria had a lot of cases, and so the counties around them controlled borders through bubbles. So of course there's a lot of traffic across border, but it doesn't have to. You don't have to build a wall, right on the line. You can say, okay, those people are working, let's say a town or whatever. There's a lot of traffic that could be some kind of bubble, and we manage it as such. It doesn't really matter which side you're on of the political border. That requires, again, community involvement and applications, their implementation. I think that's the main thing. And the thing the government is doing, as expected, is they're not pushing, but they're propping up a bit herd immunity. It's not their strategy, but if you have that as an alternative that's realistic, everything else becomes crazy. It's like it's like in the US now, if you're a bit left of Trump, now you're a big leftist, right? Even though you might just be like a big right winger. So it's a challenge. But again, I think for me, what would be more convincing is to show countries that were successful. If you had no countries at zero COVID, you could say, okay, this is just some kind of dreamer. But we have more than one. People think sometimes, oh, it's just New Zealand. No, it's not just New Zealand. And I would think, I don't know, one of my big issues is I don't understand really why the business community is not more pro-elimination, because we've had economic data coming out of China last week, big increase in GDP, or at least bigger than other countries, very positive data because they've just killed COVID, really. And then Korea had very good economic data yesterday as well. And the financial press is really clear on this. One big reason is because they don't have a COVID environment anymore. So there's usually in social activism, it's always like the capitalists against the people or something. And in many respects, I think it's still the case now, but if I was a business owner, I could really see rationally the point of having no COVID and people come to your restaurant or something. So it may be that the business community will kind of shift at some point, because one lockdown or two, if you have a vaccine in 6 months, I can see the rationale for that. I don't agree with it, but I can see why someone would want to drag people through it. But 4, 5, 6 lockdowns, that's a lot of downtime for a business, So it may be that the window is open now, trying to publicize cases of success. I think that's the best way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I listened to actually an ISAC meeting, and I think the figure over 1.4 billion people worldwide are living in an effective elimination scenario. So it's not pie in the sky at all, and 1.4 billion people are living as close to normal lives as you can in the middle of a global pandemic. And I think the images of there's a music festival that happened in Wuhan towards the end of August. Thousands of people in a water park being able to enjoy normal life. Again, more recently in Australia last weekend, the Australian Football League final. The week before that, the game between Australia and New Zealand in Auckland, where I think 47,000 people were in a stadium together. Like, that's the type of scenario I think that will really sell this to people, give people hope again. I just want to touch. I know you got into, I guess, the business case for zero COVID, and I think the sands are shifting there. I think we've seen yesterday morning on RTE Drive Time, there's someone from IBEC on, of all places. And they were starting to make the argument for zero COVID. But I think as this argument starts to kind of gain traction, we're going to be arguing and I guess debating is what kind of zero COVID strategy we're after. And here we have a question from Alex. So we've had a lot of discussion so far about the types of restrictions, but she asks, as well as the necessary restrictions, what role do supports for workers and people play in a zero COVID strategy? So I might go to you, Maeve, on that one first, and then back to you, Julian.
So I'm not sure. So would that be in terms of a zero COVID strategy? Like, I would love to see the implementation of a universal living wage, so that the pressure of people in terms of employment kind of wasn't there. And in terms, just to read the question again, I suppose like I can only learn from the other countries who are doing this well. But obviously the proper track and test and trace system needs to be in place. Everyone who comes into the hospital, like as a patient, already gets tested, so that's good. But potentially a testing for frontline health workers as well would be part of it. And I think the key thing is for people who come into the country and making sure that they're quarantined. So how would that happen? And again, that might prove complicated for the north with the England, Scotland, and Wales. So I wouldn't really be too educated to answer that too much, but I think it's a great question.
Thanks for that, Maeve. I guess the same to you, Julian. And again, to kind of flesh it out a little bit, I think we see people are more willing to take a hit and comply with the restrictions if there's a kind of level of social solidarity there, if people's incomes and lives are protected and secure. If I think there is, if the state does kind of create an environment where we can feel that we're all in it together, do you think do you think that that's important, and what kind of supports would be important in a zero COVID strategy?
Well, the economic supports, they really go in parallel with a lockdown strategy or a zero COVID strategy. You can't ask people to stay home and lose their jobs just because you feel that the case will go down. So I mean, the important thing is the level of supports are fine, because I was talking to a union person who told me, of course, all the members mostly are for zero COVID. They're not stupid, right? I mean, who would want to live with the virus if you can live without the virus? But he said people are really caught in between here. It's a catch-22, because if you don't have the right support, economic supports to keep you at home, let's say you're not in an essential job, what do you do? Well, you stay at home and you don't have your income and you're safe health-wise, or you go work and you're not safe health-wise, but at least you can make your family live. So that's why they go together, really. You can't argue for a lockdown or anything like that if you don't have the economic supports. And again, we can debate how much and all that, but both for businesses and for individuals. And again, businesses, as long as I am to another person, an economist, who is saying there's some economic sectors which are not good, zero-hour contracts, low-paid job. We don't really want that if we want a good economy. So if they go, I mean, you have to replace them with something, but it's not as if the economy is static and the same sectors stay there forever. Same with the airlines. I mean, okay, we talk about climate change. Do we want to support that many airlines or that style? You can question things. As long as you support people, it can be an opportunity to restructure the economy, Green New Deal or whatever.
Absolutely, and I think one of the key areas there, and one of the places where we definitely would like to see no going back, is in healthcare. And I think we've seen the importance of it now, but I think now would be the ideal time to invest in providing free access to healthcare and social care for everyone across the island. So that's another one that I think, as a campaign, we'd very much like to see, and it's kind of why we've called this meeting tonight, because I think when these discussions are happening about what kind of COVID strategy we're going to follow, I think we have to pay attention to the supports and services and I guess guarantees that are there for people's lives and livelihoods. There's a few more questions, but they're mostly technical and they're directed to Anthony. So I might actually, I won't take any more questions, but I'll give you both, if you want, the chance to make any kind of closing remarks you'd like. So maybe you first, Julian, and then you, Maeve.
Well, yeah, I hope my technologically challenged computer wasn't too annoying. I think, it was a very interesting discussion. I think, like I was saying, to reach those types of goals, I think many people online now would probably agree on the goals, is really to focus on how do you get there what kind of actions do you do? What kind of campaigns do you organize? There's no point at all, I think, talking about the end goal. We all agree on that. There's no, are we really going to debate all island, all universal, or 90% universal? There's no point arguing on that. It's really about the campaigning, and that's it has to be very creative, right? I mean, for repeal, the T-shirts with the repeal became super popular. I mean, who would have guessed? Okay, that worked. Other things, I don't know if it's community action or whatever, but I find that in Ireland very often I go to meetings of activists, and like I said, everybody agrees on what's wrong. Everybody agrees with what would be ideal, but then the discussion ends there. You don't even talk about what to do, other than another meeting or a petition or some Facebook group. And then, of course, it doesn't work because you haven't talked about what to do. So I think that's really and again, anybody who says they have all the answers on that is lying, because it depends on the specifics and everything. But like I said, in healthcare, the public sentiment is really there. We don't have to convince people that, it would be amazing to have a universal healthcare or something. So that's a big advantage, especially with COVID. People see it. So I think that's it. There's creative actions, but as long as it's about targets, feasible, winnable battles, and that's it.
Thanks for that, Julian. And just to follow up there, I would encourage everybody that's watching to get in touch with us and look at how you can get involved, because we will be looking at all sorts of creative actions. We've obviously got our petition, we have our open letter, which we got a lot of people signed up to now, and we do have some of those local and community actions. But beyond that, we're looking to build out across the island in all sorts of creative ways. So please do get in touch, and together I think we can look at achieving some of those smaller goals towards the ultimate one of a campaign for an All-Ireland NHS. To you, Maeve, any closing remarks?
I think it's great to have this forum and this campaign. I think what I love about it most is that it's looking at a vision for something really positive to really transform the healthcare system, and it's looking at all the different bits and pieces that make up our healthcare system, which is important to us for our health and social well-being. And I think this forum is really important. These public talks are very good to allow us the time to think and to learn about things like zero COVID, and to connect with other people who want to actually come together to make a better healthcare system, north and south, and on a united front, north and south, because it just makes sense to have that All-Ireland healthcare strategy, but also to tackle this current pandemic within an All-Ireland basis. And I think that the work that we do in healthcare is founded on care, and as we do look forward, we need to reimagine a world that is founded on care as well, and make that the priority rather than profit or things like that. So we need to look after ourselves and each other as we move forward, still into the thickness of this crisis. But it's great to have the opportunity to look towards the light at the end of the tunnel.
Thanks, Maeve. Thanks for that. And thanks, Julian, again for speaking as well. And thanks to Anthony, who's gone. For everyone who's watching, we will be having another online public meeting in about 2 weeks' time. We have quite a good programme of meetings to get us all through the next few weeks of lockdown and beyond. So keep an eye out for those. I'd also encourage everyone to check out the ISAG website, the group that Julian and Anthony are part of. They have a roadmap document or a strategy for achieving zero COVID with a lot more detail in it, and some really good meetings too. I've actually posted one of them in the comment section there, which details kind of how Australia were able to achieve an elimination scenario. So I'd encourage everyone to watch that, get a better sense of things, and also to get involved with our campaign, as I said earlier. So thanks everyone for watching, and good night.